Gross domestic product is a measure of country's economic output and is often used as an indicator of its economic health. But what does it really mean? In this video, we will explore what GDP is, how it's calculated, difference between real and nominal GDP, GDP's growth rate, GDP per capita, limitations and importance of GDP for policymakers and why it matters. Before we start this video, I would like to request you all please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos like this. Gross domestic product or GDP that we often see in TV or newspaper is linked with country's growth or stability. GDP is the monetary or market value of all final goods and services, whereas monetary value refers to the amount paid in cash in order to obtain the assets or services. Or in more simple terms, GDP is the most commonly used measure of economic activity during one fiscal year. The word domestic in gross domestic product indicates to all the goods and services that are produced within the country's border. For example, the production of Chinese-owned company in UK will be counted as UK's GDP. It includes each and everything that is produced within the country. For example, it can be eatables, consumables, liabilities, or assets. We can measure the economy of a country by using the Bureau of Economic Analysis method, which calculates the consumption, investments, government spendings, and net exports of a particular country in a specified time period of 1 year. GDP is divided into two categories, nominal GDP and real GDP. Let's see the difference between them. Nominal GDP is the measure of economic output that doesn't adjust for inflation, and the reason is because nominal GDP is measured in current prices. Therefore, nominal GDP will include all the changes in market prices that have occurred during the current year due to inflation or deflation. For example, if a country sold iPhones of $500,000 during first year and $900,000 in next year, that would make an 80% increase compared to the first year. Now, you might think that company made 80% more profit than last year, which is wrong, due to the possibility of increase in both production and prices of iPhones from year 1 to year 2. In order to abstract from overall price changes, another measure of GDP called real GDP is used. Real GDP is GDP evaluated at the market prices of some base year. For example, if 2015 was chosen as the base year, then real GDP for 2020 is calculated by taking the quantities of all goods and services purchased in 2020 and multiplying them by their 2015 prices. In simple terms, real GDP takes inflation into account and is also called inflation adjusted GDP. GDP growth rate is the measure of country's output over a span of one time period to another time period, which is typically 1 year to another year. It can be a positive or negative number. For example, if GDP of any country in 2021 is set as GDP1 and GDP of 2022 is set as GDP2, then we can calculate the GDP by using the following formula. If the result is in positive number, it means the economy is growing, and if the result is in negative, it means the economy is contracting. GDP per capita is the parameter to globally measure the prosperity of nations. It is used by economists to analyze the prosperity of a country based on its economic growth. GDP itself is a gross measure of country's economy, but only the growing GDP isn't the sign of a prosperous country. GDP per capita plays an important role to decide if the country's economy is progressing towards a prosperous country or not. Governments can use GDP per capita to understand how the economy is growing with its population. If a country's population is growing faster than its GDP, then it has a negative GDP. Similarly, some countries might have small population with high GDP per capita, which means they have built enough resources to become self-sufficient. Or you can say that countries with highest GDP may or may not have highest GDP per capita. The most recent example of such scenario is India leaving behind UK in terms of higher GDP. But it turned out that GDP per capita of India is around $2,000 while GDP per capita of UK is around $46,000, majorly because of overpopulation in India. Let's have a look on top 4 countries with highest GDP rate. As you can see, at number 1 is USA, which is definitely not a surprise. The GDP of USA is around $20 trillion. At number 2 is China. The GDP of China is around 14.7 trillion. Important factor is that China is also the world's most populous country, which certainly will have its impacts on GDP per capita. At number 3 is Japan, and the GDP of Japan is around $5 trillion. Germany is also not far behind, sitting at number 4, whereas the GDP of Germany is $3.8 trillion. Let's see the top 4 countries depending on GDP per capita. Luxembourg is at number 1 with $128,819 per capita, following by Ireland, Switzerland, and Qatar. GDP per capita is a popular metric for the average prosperity and well-being of a country. Unlike some other measures of economic productivity, it takes population size into account, allowing easy comparison between countries with different sizes. Limitations of GDP. While GDP is a useful measure of economic activity, it has several limitations due to which it has been criticized as a measure of economic well being, such as non market activities such as volunteer work, household production, and the informal economy are not accounted, which means GDP may underestimate the actual level of economic activity in a country. Income inequality is also not reflected. This means that GDP can overestimate the level of economic well being for the general population, as the benefits of economic growth may not be evenly distributed. Environmental costs are not factored, which means GDP may overstate the level of economic well being if these costs are not taken into account. Quality of life is not reflected, for example, it does not account for improvements in health, education, or social welfare. As a result, GDP may not provide a complete picture of overall standard of living in a country. Underground economy is also not measured, which includes activities such as illegal trade, unreported income, and black market activities, which may result in GDP underestimating the level of economic activity in a country. Now let's see how GDP data is crucial for policymakers. Economic growth measurement. GDP is used to measure economic growth over time. Policymakers can use this data to track the performance of the economy and make decisions about when to implement policies for potential growth. By using the GDP data, policymakers can also assess the current stage of business cycle and calculate their risk as per business cycle. For example, during a recession, policymakers may use GDP data to determine whether to implement expansionary policies such as increasing government spendings or lowering interest rates. Identifying areas of weakness. GDP can also assist policymakers to identify areas of weakness in the economy. For example, if growth is low, policymakers may look at specific sectors that are underperforming and target policies to address those areas. In conclusion, GDP is a vital concept in economics that plays a crucial role in informing economic policy decisions. I hope this video has provided you comprehensive understanding of GDP. If you have any questions related to this topic, you can ask them in comment section.